Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 217, Fallout. As the title suggests, in this episode we deal with the fallout from the Battle of Pavia, which saw the French king, Francis I, become the captive of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Of course, for Francis this was absolutely devastating. It eliminated forever the possibility that he might be remembered as one of France's greatest military kings. Getting captured in battle tends to do that to one's reputation. Plus, there was no way of knowing how much Francis and France would need to pay to get him out of custody. Now for Charles, as we will see, the situation was more nuanced. Sure, he had the advantage, but he needed to get guarantees out of Francis that he would actually comply with once released, which was much easier said than done. Moreover, Charles's conflict with France was always part of a larger European puzzle for Charles. He still had to deal with the Lutheran controversy, and the Ottomans were still pounding at the gates of Vienna. And then there's Henry. Henry VIII was also overjoyed at the news that Francis had fallen into imperial custody. But Henry was now increasingly concerned with domestic matters. Namely, he wanted an heir, and he did not have one. At least, not a male heir. So let's get going. We have a lot to cover. Henry VIII was jubilant as he heard the news that Francis had fallen into Charles's clutches. He announced his intention to write to the emperor, quote, "Now is the time for the emperor and myself to devise the means of getting full satisfaction from France. Not an hour is to be lost." Henry, here, seems to completely ignore the reality that Francis was Charles's prisoner, not his. Nor did Henry do anything to aid the emperor at Pavia. Frankly, other than diplomatic courtesy, there's no reason at all Charles should have cared in the least what Henry thought should be done with Francis. Charles's reaction to the news was much more measured. Charles was in Spain when he heard the news from Pavia on March the 10th, 1525. He did not do a fist pump and shout for joy as Henry did. Rather, the emperor retired to think on the matter and pray. Henry and Charles's brother Ferdinand both argued that France should be partitioned between the Empire and England and maybe Navarre, and Francis made an example of. Charles quietly dismissed this foolishness. It had not worked for the Lancastrians in the 100 Years' War, and it certainly wasn't going to work now. Whatever Charles could get Francis to agree to, he was concerned that it be legal and not an inch more than he could get. Charles had won. There was no reason to gloat over it. The emperor instructed his men around Milan to take good care of Francis. Now, we can't forget that France still has to function as a kingdom, even with its king in the clink. So Louise found her regency prolonged indefinitely. Louise was a skilled diplomat, but now she found her skills severely tested. Not only did she have to deal with Charles's ambassadors, who held just about all the cards, but Henry's bumptious adventurism to boot. Henry, throughout the summer of 1525, continued to behave as though France really was going to be partitioned. Honestly, had Henry invaded right now, he probably would have won. France's defenses were in a terrible state. Even before Pavia, the treasury had grown so bankrupt that most of the northern garrisons had abandoned their posts for want of pay. Plus, much of the kingdom's artillery was now in Imperial hands. And, of course, France's best general, the Duke of Bourbon, was on the other side. Luckily for France, as we're about to see, Henry was distracted by domestic concerns at the present and unable to tear himself away for an attack on his ancient enemy. When the Duke of Albany recrossed the Alps in April with what remained of the French army, Louis was faced with further problems. While his return might have seemed like a good thing, more protection for the kingdom, these troops expected to be disbanded and paid. Francis's plan had been to pay them out of the booty from a successful campaign. Now Louise faced the prospect of yet more disaffected troops roaming the countryside. Understanding the peril she was facing, Louise trimmed the household budget, cut corners, sold what she could, and managed to scrounge up enough money to pay the men. But how long could she keep this up? Louise was advanced in her years and now suffering from gout. Yet she admirably rose to the challenges of the time, dealing effectively with both Parliament and the Royal Regency Council. She was given a good stroke of luck thanks to Henry's repeated inabilities to follow through with his promises, leading Charles to question everything his erstwhile ally said. But still, once again, Louise found herself doing everything she could to save her son's kingdom. As his mother tried to keep his country together, Francis's captivity continued. Francis was now interred in the Piscatini castle, not far from modern-day Cremona. There he was kept abreast of affairs, but could do little to determine their course. Francis saw his hopes of a quick release fade, as it became clear Charles wanted more than just a generous cash payment, which, of course, he wanted as well. Charles firmly believed that the only way to secure peace in Europe was to secure Habsburg hegemony over the continent. Francis, still foolishly clinging to his medieval chivalric beliefs, thought that if he just talked things through with Charles man to man, then they might resolve this. Charles was in no mood to be conciliatory. He began by informing Francis that, if he wanted, he could himself assert a claim to the French throne through his father, Philip. In his magnanimity, Charles was willing to set aside this claim. In the end, what Charles really wanted was Burgundy. Burgundy had been a Habsburg possession until 1477, and Charles wanted it back. If Charles got Burgundy, however, Francis would lose a huge chunk of his kingdom and risk the perennial threat of a Habsburg lightning strike on Paris. There were other demands, of course. Money, the return of Tournai in Belgium, etc., etc. Frankly, there were so many demands that it might just have been easier for Charles to demand the French throne and be done with it. It seems very likely that what Charles was doing initially was making a series of outlandish demands in the expectation that he would need to concede about 90% of them later on. That way, what he did get would look more reasonable by comparison, but still be everything he wanted. Still, some of these demands were downright absurd. Consider the following partial list. Provence, to be given to the Duke of Bourbon as his personal duchy. Toulouse, taken away from the Kingdom of France and joined with Aragon. And the cherry on the top, Henry VIII should just be allowed to get whatever lands he claimed were his. And, spoiler alert, that's all the lands. Oh, and also, Francis was going to have to join Charles on a crusade against the Turks with whatever power he had left, which I'm guessing at this point would have amounted to Francis and maybe the shirt on his back. With said back up against the wall, Francis tried to prevaricate. He claimed Burgundy wasn't his to give. He said the whole matter should be sorted out by a neutral third-party arbitrator. And in the event that none of this worked, Francis suggested a marriage alliance. Perhaps even he, Francis, might wed the emperor's sister. This was a ludicrous suggestion for someone who was in prison, but Francis was clearly playing for time. Francis, still acknowledging that he was a prisoner, was more accommodating on many of Charles's other demands. He conceded that his adventures in northern Italy were done. Milan would remain the property of the empire. Moreover, he begrudgingly agreed to return all the Duke of Bourbon's lands to him and drop all the lawsuits against him. While that sure stung, Francis had little other choice. It's impossible, however, to know whether or not Francis was sincere about any of this. Given later events, it's certainly possible he was just playing along with the charade and waiting until he could be freed. After all, then he could just deny whatever he agreed to. And that was Charles's biggest problem. Sure, Francis might agree to whatever while he's in custody, but what happened after the French king was released? As the king's captivity continued, imperial advisors grew more and more weary about his present location. The castle was very close to the French border. It was not inconceivable that the French might plan a lightning raid to try to free their king. So it was deemed safer to move Francis to Spain. On May the 31st, Francis was escorted to Genoa and told that he was going to Naples. Instead, by June the 17th, the flotilla had reached Palamos on the Catalan coast, and 2 days later, anchored in Barcelona. From there, Francis was moved to Valencia, and thence from country house to country house as the negotiations continued. That summer found Charles in Castile. Francis requested that his sister, Marguerite, be allowed safe passage through Spain to conduct negotiations on his behalf. Francis, though they're now both in the same kingdom at least, never negotiated directly with Charles. Now, the emperor agreed to talk to his sister, but at first the sides made little headway. The major obstacle remaining was the future of Burgundy. In late July, the emperor seems to have felt that Francis needed a little reminding about who won the Battle of Pavia. So he had the French king moved to the Alcazar fortress in Seville. There, the king was kept in a perfectly normal cell with few accommodations. If Francis wanted to draw out negotiations, so be it. But Charles wasn't going to make it pleasant for him. It was no coincidence, then, a few days after arriving in his new home, Francis told the French negotiators that he had no intention of turning over Burgundy. He told them they could agree to whatever they wanted with Charles. From this point forward, he was not negotiating in good faith. Treaties signed under duress were not considered valid. Francis now believed that anything he signed was under duress, so there was no point in arguing the terms of the treaty. A part of this is clearly Francis's mental state. Francis was a man used to vigorous physical activity, and now found himself confined to one tiny room. The impact of said incarceration was clearly having an effect on him. On September the 11th, Francis collapsed in his cell, suffering from a high fever and a nasal abscess. His doctors feared he was going to die. Had it would have proved to be an ignominious end to a reign that had begun so promisingly. But as it so often does, the wheel of fate was about to turn again. While her son was near death, Louise continued to do her level best to keep the kingdom afloat. It soon became obvious to everyone that the key to finding a peace treaty was not to negotiate with Charles. If the French could strike a separate treaty with England, then Henry VIII could put pressure on Charles to release Francis and bring the matter to a conclusion. This worked quite well, given the mistrust between Charles and Henry. Both sides believed the other would cut them out in a peace treaty, so the first to the proverbial honeypot won. So it was that on August the 30th, 1525, Cardinal Wolsey signed the Treaty of Moore on Henry's behalf. It was a boon for the English. Literally all Henry had to do was lobby for Francis's release. France, on the other hand, had to pay 2 million gold écus spread over 20 years, and agreed never again to support any further Scottish incursions in northern England. It was a huge win for Henry and Wolsey, and restored English-French relations to their field of gold of cloth levels. This was not Louis's only effort to go around the emperor. While negotiating with Wolsey, the French regent also sent emissaries to Suleiman the Magnificent in Constantinople. And we will, by the way, shift east here shortly to talk about the Ottomans in much more detail. Louis suggested that Charles was a bane to the Ottomans and that, should the Turks send an army, the French would not oppose it. Louis would not go further with the Ottomans, however. There was still a significant amount of stigma when discussing a potential alliance with Muslims. While Louis worked to get Francis home, the French Parliament picked this moment to try and advance its own religious ideals, which were reformist in nature. Parliament also figured now would be a good time to pick apart some of the traditional liberties the French monarchy enjoyed. With the king incarcerated, the French Parliament sought to include more legislative oversight over how the monarchy operated. What I think this tells us is that, for most of the people in France, their king's capture was not an existential crisis. Rather, most Frenchmen assumed Francis would, at some point, be released. Upon that release, he would go back to being king, and so now is the time to get concessions. It also tells us that no one in France took seriously any discussions about partitioning the kingdom. Charles, for his part, flew in a total panic when he heard the news of Francis's physical collapse. If the French king died, then he was going to get nothing. It was, frankly, probably the best case scenario for France. Charles rushed to Francis's side to wish the ailing king well. A far more welcomed advisor arrived several days later from Barcelona, Marguerite, Francis's sister. She truly believed her brother was going to die and had come to pay her final respects. On September the 22nd, the end seemed near. Yet just as Marguerite and Charles prepared to weep, albeit for very different reasons, the nasal abscess that was the source of the affliction burst of its own accord, and Francis regained consciousness. Marguerite immediately embraced her brother, overjoyed at his recovery. What she did not tell Francis was that, back in Paris, many powerful men were starting to grumble that Francis was unfit to rule and needed to be replaced as king whether he recovered or not. In other words, if Francis still wanted a kingdom, he needed to get home quick. So around this time, those around Francis actually conceived of a frankly really stupid plan for him to escape. The idea was that Francis would, and yes, this is real, disguise himself as a black servant and escape. So Francis's grand scheme to get out involved donning blackface. Not a good look either way, buddy. Almost before whoever had come up with this insanely stupid idea was done talking, someone with half a brain shut them up. First of all, if caught, Francis was just never getting out, period. Second, even if Francis escaped, all this would mean was more war with the empire, and Francis had a really bad track record there, so that wasn't an option. If Francis wanted out of his prison, he was going to have to give Charles what he wanted. End of story. The final nail in the coffin came from Louise. She wrote to her son that if he wanted to save his kingdom, he had to get home, whatever the cost. At one point, Francis had been prepared to cede his kingdom to the Dauphin, but his son was hardly more than a toddler. So that would have resulted in the exact same situation as at the present. Louis as regent, and likely regent for a lot longer. And his mother was not, well, there were very real questions as to how much longer she was going to live. And if she died, whoever took over the regency would be much more likely to just declare himself king and be done with it. So out of options, Francis finally signed the Treaty of Madrid on January the 14th, 1526. Again, he did so with the understanding that, because the treaty had been signed under duress, he would not need to abide by its terms. Had Charles known the character of the man he was negotiating with, he never would have let Francis go. The terms of the treaty were honestly borderline ridiculous, and make the Treaty of Versailles after World War I look tame by comparison. Burgundy would go to the Empire. Half of Navarre would go to Castile. All French claims to northern Italy were to be abandoned. The Duke of Bourbon and his accomplices would get all their lands back and guaranteed to be freed from future prosecution. Frankly, I cannot believe that Charles ever thought that Francis would actually stick with any of this, but I guess he did. Francis did get Charles to agree to 2 points. First, Francis told Charles that ceding Burgundy would lead to a massive uproar in France. Hence, in order to get the French to swallow it, Francis needed to be home before that part of the treaty was finalized. Charles foolishly agreed. Second, Francis wanted to marry Charles's sister. The reason for this demand was simple. Charles previously promised the hand of his sister to the Duke of Bourbon. Francis hated the Duke and wanted to slight him, so he demanded Eleanor's hand in marriage. Charles, reasoning that a king was always better than a duke, agreed. Charles also believed that the match proved Francis's sincerity in signing the treaty. He was wrong. Part of the deal was that Francis would turn over both of his sons, the Dauphin, Francis, and the young Henri. Their release would only take place if and when Francis had fulfilled his treaty obligations. Given that, 2 days before agreeing to turn over his sons, Francis signed a secret agreement nullifying the transfer of Burgundy to Charles, this was a huge risk for his dynasty, but one that, given the circumstances, he was willing to take. Francis's health remained precarious throughout January 1526. As a result, he did not leave Madrid until mid-February, long after he signed the treaty. Charles last visited with Francis in mid-February, each trying his best to understand the other under the cover of diplomatic niceties. Francis had not been Charles's only concern this last year. The Spanish Cortes demanded that Charles marry, and so he was going to, and to their choice bride, no less, Isabella of Portugal. Of Isabella, next to nothing bad has ever been written. She was stunningly beautiful, brilliantly educated, politically astute, and a patient and loving wife. More than all that, she managed to bear Charles that rarest and most precious gift, a Habsburg heir that was actually a good ruler, Philip II. Isabella had been the Castilian Cortes' only choice for queen. She was the perfect candidate. Not only did she possess all the virtues I just outlined, but she came with an enormous dowry of 1 million ducats. This, more than anything else, attests to the massive wealth Vasco da Gama's voyages and their fruit were now bringing into Portugal. Charles wrote apologetically to Henry VIII, explaining why he had to cancel the marriage contract with Princess Mary. Frankly, I sympathize with Charles. He had little choice in the matter, and on the practical side, why marry a girl less than 10, and you could marry a woman? After all, Charles still needs an heir, and Mary was a long time from being able to provide that in 1526. Henry VIII, rational as always, kidding, responded ferociously. Ironically, it was partly because of Charles's marriage to Isabella that Wolsey finally convinced Henry to sign the separate treaty with France, and that gave Francis the confidence to sign the Treaty of Madrid. Charles would finally meet Isabella on February 7, 1526, and the couple would be married shortly thereafter. The two genuinely seemed to have fallen in love with each other at first sight. Still, we can't chalk this up as some kind of romance for all time. Husband and wife maintained separate households throughout their lives, and Charles had numerous affairs and sired many bastards. They exchanged few personal letters throughout their many absences, but in terms of early modern royal Europe, their match was about as good as it got. Going back to Charles and Francis, the two rulers parted ways on February 19th. Charles, bound for Seville to marry Isabella, Francis, at long last, bound for home. On the day of the exchange, Francis, still under guard, was rowed out across the Loire River. His sons, on an opposite boat, came to meet him. He embraced his sons and promised them a swift return to France. Then he made the sign of the cross on each of their chests and watched as they sailed to the opposite shore. He had to wonder if he would ever see them again. Once out of Spanish custody, Francis jumped on the shore, proclaiming, "I am king again." But his return was unpretentious. Only his general, Lautrec, and a few nobles waited for him. Francis was free at last. However, the road ahead looked bleak. He knew he had intended to break the Treaty of Madrid almost immediately. That left his sons to pay for the sins of the father. But that was the least of Francis's concerns. He needed to restore faith in the monarchy and reestablish France as a European power to be reckoned with. How would he do that? I'm not sure even he knew. But he realized the task at hand would likely last for the foreseeable future, perhaps the balance of his reign. For the rest of today's episode, I want to bring Henry up to the eve of the English Reformation, which we will turn to in much greater detail next week. Henry took part in his last major tournament in Christmas 1524, at the age of 33. 2 months later, Henry leapt for joy at the news of the Battle of Pavia. Not only was his enemy the captive of the emperor, but the last real pretender to the English throne, Richard de la Pole, had been killed in the fighting. Upon hearing the news, the king exclaimed, "All the enemies of England are gone." Oh, if only. Henry's biggest enemy in early 1525 was the mud. And that's not a lord's name or anything. I mean, literally, wet dirt. Henry was out hawking and chasing his prey through the English countryside when a bizarre accident occurred. Henry, and I'm not making this up, tried to pole vault over a stream when the pole broke and he landed face down in the clay and mud of the stream. Unable to free himself, Henry would have died, were it not for a quick-thinking footman who jumped in and saved him. As a quick aside, if Henry would have died, I think we'd have to wonder who had the stupider death, Henry VIII versus muddy stream, or Charles VIII versus latrine brick. Regardless, Henry came away from the incident terrified that he was in his early 30s and still had not resolved the succession. The problem was that everyone at court was now resigned to the fact that the Queen would never bear Henry a son. Henry did have a son, Henry Fitzroy, his bastard son through Elizabeth Blount, and there were significant rumors in 1525 that Henry was going to make him his heir. In June of 1525, Henry had his illegitimate son elevated to the Order of the Garter. Queen Catherine was aware of Henry Fitzroy's existence, of course. True to her kind character, she never seemed to bear the child any ill will. Only several days later, Henry made his son the Duke of Richmond and Somerset and the Earl of Nottingham. All signs were pointing to Henry Fitzroy being the next King of England. Royal titles did not necessarily denote an heir, but they underlined the Duke's high status and royal blood. According to a Venetian ambassador, the message was loud and clear. He, Henry Fitzroy, is now next in rank to His Majesty. Wolsey's dominance of Henry's court remained unchanged. However, several factors had taken him down from the godlike level at which he previously sat. First, an anti-Wolsey alliance was beginning to form on the Privy Council, centered around Thomas Boleyn. This would only grow with time. Second, and much more important, Henry had grown up. He was in his 30s now, not his teens and early 20s. He was his own man, as Thomas More would later write. If only the lion knew its strength. And now he was right. When Henry got to see a completed Hampton court, he was amazed. Wolsey's primary residency had so many more innovations than even the best of his own palaces. Just how rich had his cardinal become? Wolsey evidently noticed Henry's jealousy and immediately offered to make a gift of Hampton Court to Henry, who accepted it just as quickly. Complicating matters was the relationship between Francis, Henry, and Charles. Catherine favored closer ties with Charles, opposed by Wolsey, who wanted a Franco-Anglo alliance. But Charles's decision to jilt Princess Mary for Isabella of Portugal had profound repercussions. Catherine's association with Charles V was often the strongest reason for Henry to favor her faction. As Henry's attitude toward the emperor hardened, so did his attitude toward his queen. The summer of 1525 witnessed the worst outbreak of plague in 10 years. Over 50 people died per day in London. So, as usual, the king and his court retired to the safer country houses. In August of 1525, Princess Mary moved to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh marches in the care of Lady Salisbury, who would prove to be like a second mother to the young lady. While Yesenia Pestes worked to slash the number of people in the kingdom, Wolsey worked to do the same, but to the king's court. His excuse was economy. To be fair, Henry's court was ruinously expensive. This effort to trim the fat, known as the Eltham Ordinances, was not the first, nor would it be the last effort to reduce the insane level of spending coming out of Henry's court. It was, however, the first major effort by Cardinal Wolsey to restrain the king in any way. Naturally, in and amongst all these budget cuts, Wolsey's enemies were the first to go, including George Boleyn, Anne's brother. But Wolsey had convinced Henry that all was for the best, and the cardinal moved swiftly to minimize any threat to his authority. The gentlemen of the chamber were reduced from 12 to 6, grooms of the chamber from 15 to 4. Wolsey were going to make sure these budget cuts benefited him as much as Henry's privy purse. There is no doubt that the Eltham Ordinances achieved what they were meant to do, though, looking askance at the cardinal, many considered them, quote, more profitable than honorable. However, historians have often questioned just how much lasting impact the ordinances had. The Privy Council continued to expand after 1526. Certainly, for many men, the ordinances of 1526 were well-intentioned, but they lacked the means of enforcement necessary for a change. Hence, the Royal Eltham Ordinances would not be the last effort to reel in royal spending. By late February 1526, little of this mattered. By then, the English king Henry VIII had fallen hopelessly in love, perhaps for the first time in his life. A letter from Henry to Anne from the year 1527 indicates that the affair had been ongoing for over a year. In the spring of 1526, Henry had the royal goldsmith put together 4 brooches, each of which historians believe were intended for Anne. Hence, by early 1526, it seemed that the King of England had taken up with his most famous mistress, the sister of one of his former mistresses. This was none other than Anne Boleyn, whose relationship with the king will alter the course of Western history. There's a good case to be made that, had Catherine given birth to a son, none of what was going to happen next would have happened. Not that this was her fault. The sex of any child is the flip of a coin. Every time the odds are 50-50. What happens next is by no means Catherine's fault. But there is a very good argument that, had she given birth to a boy, none of it would have happened. After all, Henry wasn't opposed to having extramarital affairs. He'd had plenty of those in the past. He wanted a legitimate heir, and hence everything that happened afterwards. That being said, there was something different about Anne Boleyn. Driven by ambition, she refused to become the king's lover. This was something new for Henry, whose previous conquests had given in before he had really even begun trying. For Henry, this was probably intoxicating. He relished the idea of being a medieval, chivalric knight. Henry was utterly discreet in his persecution of the affair. So much has been written about Anne since then that I could spend multiple episodes just theorizing and then debunking each theory. I won't, but let's at least walk through what the contemporaries thought of her. First of all, to discount popular media theories, no one felt that Anne was a great beauty. All of her contemporaries wondered at why Henry would choose her over her sister Mary or Elizabeth Blount, both of whom were believed to be more beautiful. A Venetian ambassador who saw her in 1532 wrote, quote, "Madame Anne is not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's appetite. But her eyes, which are black and beautiful, take great effect." Another eyewitness commented on Anne's eyes, which were beautiful and take great effect, and invited one to conversation. But Anne had something that's clear from the sources. Today, I guess we would call it sex appeal. She's very similar to Cleopatra in that regard. Both women were not considered the great beauties of their ages, yet both were utterly beguiling to the most powerful men of their times. There's something that just cannot come through the historical sources. It's something we cannot read, and we can't see it in paintings. It's something that we must have experienced only through contact. Whatever that something was, both women had it. Plus, even the sources at the time admit Anne had a, quote, slender and elegant carriage, and long and dark hair. This is the woman who would change the course of Western history. In terms of her character, that too has eluded historians for centuries. She was certainly ambitious, determined, tenacious, and frankly, ruthless. She was similar to Rodrigo Borgia in that her family came before everything else. Loyalty to the Boleyn clan would always be the most important thing to her. She was very close to her brother George. Again, not to press the comparison too far, but she reminds me in that way of Lucrezia and Cesare Borgia. If someone wants to write a history of the time and call it The English Borgias, I would gladly cede rights to the title. She was witty, high-strung, and especially unique for a woman of her time. She was very independent. She was passionately fond of music and an accomplished dancer. Now, at the point that she enters our story, Anne had only been back in England for around 4 years. Hence, most of her customs were decidedly French, and most observers at court said that anyone would assume she was a Frenchwoman. She spoke excellent French, and dressed as though a member of Francis's court, not Henry's. This might explain why, until the very end, Anne would lean on her family as a base of support. Not having grown up in the English court, Anne did not have the connections that other women did. There are also persistent rumors about what exactly Anne did during her time in Paris. King Francis would later comment to the Duke of Norfolk in 1533 that Anne had not lived virtuously. Then again, neither did Francis. Such was the double standard of the early 16th century. In December 1526, a new Spanish ambassador, Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, arrived at Henry's court. The plan was for him to smooth things over between England and the Empire and keep Henry committed to Charles. But Mendoza arrived at a very bad time to accomplish that goal, as Henry was increasingly drawn toward Francis. Mendoza, however, would prove both a good ally and solid friend to Queen Catherine. She would need both in the years to come. That Christmas was a splendid affair. Plague might have kept the lid on previous celebrations, but not this year. Wolsey threw a spectacular feast on January the 3rd, 1527. Midway through the feasting, several masked strangers arrived. Wolsey was asked to identify which one was the king. To Henry's amusement, he got it wrong. Within a week, though, Henry was in much worse spirits. News arrived from Scotland that his sister Margaret had had her most recent marriage annulled. Ironically giving future events, Henry wrote back to his sister, lecturing her that the annulment was a, quote, shameless sentence from Rome, and that she needed to behave with more decorum in the future. Fortunately for Margaret, Henry was soon preoccupied with negotiations for a new alliance with France. By February 1527, England and France had negotiated and signed the Treaty of Eternal Peace. The crux of the deal was for Princess Mary to marry Henri, Francis's second son. In theory, this meant that one day Henri would be ruler of England as Mary's consort. Certainly, this was not a satisfactory solution to the problem of succession, but it was the best that Henry could do under the circumstances. The final treaty, they renamed it the Treaty of Greenwich. Perhaps somebody read a book of English-French history and realized that the previous title was a tad too ambitious. On May the 5th, 1527. This is then when Henry began pressuring Charles to release Francis from his custody. Watching the treaty signing was Henry's sister, Mary, the Duchess of Suffolk. That would prove to be her last appearance at court. The celebrations after the signing went on for days. Then news of a disaster cut them short. The day after the Treaty of Greenwich had been signed, German forces, loyal to the emperor, but who had not been paid for months, mutinied and proceeded to sack Rome. The event drew a hysterical response from Europe. Rome had been sacked before, but never since its rise as the capital of Christendom. There was an obvious religious motivation behind the attack, or at least Catholics certainly thought so, as many of the rioting troops were Protestant. The sack permanently destroyed relations between the emperor and the pope. Charles claimed the sack was not his fault. True, he had not ordered it, but they were his unpaid troops. Had Charles not overextended his resources, there's a good argument it never would have happened. The Pope, Clement VII, escaped to Castel San Angelo after his Swiss guards were surrounded and slaughtered. And there he would remain until February 1528. His captors demanded a ransom. They never got it. In the late winter of 1528, they got Yersinia pestis rather than gold. The plague and quickly deteriorating situation in Rome forced the mercenaries to leave. Finally, the population of Rome as a result fell from 55,000 to 10,000. Back in England, the French quietly packed up for home and left. For the last 5 years, Henry's conscience had slowly torn away at him, or at least that's how he painted the picture. He was no longer sure that his marriage to Catherine had been lawful. Meeting in secret on May the 17th, Cardinal Wolsey and Archbishop Warham summoned an ecclesiastical court to hear out the issue. Henry, meanwhile, toyed with the notion of making his bastard son the King of Ireland, with the hope that such would make him a more desirable match to Maria of Portugal, Charles V's niece. Assuming that this was merely a prelude to naming the boy his heir and cutting out Princess Mary, Queen Catherine made her displeasure at the idea known. But if that upset her, it was nothing compared to what came next. On June the 22nd, 1528, Henry visited Catherine in her chambers and bluntly told her they must separate. He was asking Rome for an annulment. Catherine, beside herself with grief, wrote at once to Charles, begging for his help. And so thus began the historical event known as the King's Great Matter. It would dominate English life for the next, depending on how long you push out the repercussions, I guess 80 years. Now, to be clear, there was no open rift between the king and the queen. Catherine came with Henry on his summer progress, but he didn't visit her in the evenings. Now, Wolsey was no fool. He knew the Pope was locked up in Sant'Angelo, and he was effectively the emperor's prisoner. Given the circumstances, there was no chance that he would agree to a proposed annulment. As a result, Henry then reached out to the recently released Francis, asking him to support the Pope's release. For her part, Anne continued to play hard to get. She knew what happened to Henry's paramours after he sated his lust. She had no interest in being tossed away. She wanted not just Henry, but the crown. Anne was not a member of the nobility, but there was a precedent for a king marrying a commoner, albeit a very recent one. Edward IV married Elizabeth Wydeville in 1464. 17 of Henry's love letters to Anne from 1527 to 1529 survive, which portray his deep passion. Anne's replies, sadly, are lost, and she continued to keep her distance from Henry. At least until 1531, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest that Henry and Anne had not slept together. Henry told Catherine as much, and a rumor reached the Vatican that same year that no adultery had, as of yet, been committed. Interestingly, the King of England was aware that he wasn't the only suitor for Anne's hand. The English poet Thomas Wyatt also desired a relationship with Lady Boleyn. I suppose, in hindsight, she should have gone with the poet. Anne's relationship with Wyatt has long been the subject of controversy. 4 of Wyatt's poems have been cited as evidence of the poet's feelings for Anne. Here they are. What word is that changeth not, though it be turned and made in twain? It is my Anna, God it wot, and eke the causer of my pain, who love reward with disdain. Number 2. Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds and letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Number 3. Then do I love again, if thou ask whom, sure since I did refrain, her that did set our country in a roar. And finally, sometime I fled the fire that me brent, meaning burned, by sea, land, by water, and by wind, and now I follow the coals that be quenched from Dover to Calais against my mind. Lo, how desire is both sprung and spent. While to me those seem vague insofar as definitive evidence goes, I suppose if they're evidence of anything, they're evidence of Wyatt's feelings, not Anne's. While Wolsey was absent in France, ironically negotiating for Henry's divorce, Anne worked to diminish his influence with the king. Really, for the first time ever, there was more than one avenue to power in England. Wolsey was no longer the only game in town. As Anne began to realize her power, she used it to secure promotions for her friends and family, further cementing her position. It didn't take long for Wolsey to realize just how much things had changed. When he got back from France on September 17th, he sent a messenger requesting a private audience with Henry, as was his custom. He wanted to know where he should meet the king. But the king was with Anne. According to our sources, before Henry could respond, Anne told the messenger that the cardinal should come at once. Here, with her, after all, was where the king was. The gauntlet was thrown. From this point on, the fate of England was largely determined by a running battle between King Henry's most important advisor and his lover. The winter of 1527-28 was especially bitter. Even the sea froze in places. Henry kept Christmas at Greenwich. Anne was not with him. But the weather was much improved when Henry and Anne met again at Windsor in March. The change in weather heralded a larger change coming in English politics. While no one knew it at the time, England sat on the eve of its own Reformation. Next week, we begin to dig into the English Reformation in earnest. In the meantime, if you'd like more content, check out the links in the show notes to the website, the Patreon feed, and Western Civ 2.0.